So how does the Fed control the money supply? Well, they control the money supply through open market operations, and conventionally, traditionally, the Fed has done this by buying and selling government bonds. More recently, they've engaged in a policy of quantitative easing, where they buy other securities, including some other forms of treasury bonds, and also some mortgage-backed securities. More recently, they bought very large amounts of mortgage-backed securities from government agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And they also can control the money supply by setting the reserve ratio. The Fed sets that R, and that affects the money multiplier directly. So if the Fed increased the reserve ratio from 10% to 20%, then each dollar would support 1 over R, or $5 in the money supply. Each dollar of currency would support $5 in the money supply. And then recently, the Fed has been able to have some control over the money supply by paying interest on bank deposits at the Fed. The Feds keep some of their reserve at the Federal Reserve Bank, and now the Fed pays interest on those bank deposits. This is a new phenomenon. It's only been legal since 2008, since the onset of the financial crisis. And this is an interesting development that will have some influence on macroeconomic policy moving forward. It will be interesting to see how this affects the economy. How do open market operations work? Well, when the Fed buys a bond from a bank, they put the cash in the hands of the bank. In this case, reserves go up, so loans in the money supply go up. When the Fed buys a bond from a bank, what they're doing is putting money into circulation. So they increase their reserves and increase the bank's reserve increase, and when their reserves increase, they can lend more money and put more money into the economy. When the Fed sells a bond to a bank, then the Fed is taking in money in exchange for a bank. This takes cash out of the hands of the bank, takes money out of the hands of the bank, brings down reserves, and brings down the amount of the money supply and the amount of loans that banks can make. The primary tool for open market operations for the Fed has been the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate works like this. Banks who have excess reserves can lend to banks with a shortage of reserves on any given day. Remember, banks have to be careful to stay above the reserve ratio, and banks would like to be as close to that as they can in general, because they want to. The more money they can lend out, the more money that they can bring in interest payments and revenues from their borrowers. So banks would like to lend out as much as they can. So on a given day, some banks will be very close to that limit, and some banks will have excess reserves, and some banks will have a shortage of reserves on any given day. And the Fed intervenes in this market by controlling the interest rate, by buying and selling loans in this market. So the Fed controls, the Fed influences the rate at which banks essentially borrow from each other. And the Fed uses open market operations to target this federal funds rate. Since the financial crisis, the federal funds rate has been very close to zero, between 0 and 0.25%. It's been at zero for several years now, and there's just recently talk about perhaps beginning to raise the Fed funds rate above zero this summer. So how does it work? Suppose the Fed wants to tighten the money supply. How do they do this? They sell bonds. Selling bonds takes the money out of the economy, and bank reserves fall and interest rates rise. Here's a graphical representation of what's going on. In the federal funds market, there's a supply of funds and a demand for funds that's generated by banks. And suppose that the prevailing interest rate is 3.5%. When the Fed wants to tighten the money supply, essentially the supply of funds in the federal funds market shifts to the left. The Fed sells bonds. This takes money out of the federal funds market and raises the interest rate and lowers the amount of money in the federal funds market.